All right. Hello, Science Nines. We are going to get recording and working on our Concept C4 lesson. I know that we did this lesson already, or some of this lesson, probably most of this lesson back before all of this stuff with COVID-19 started. So I'm going to run through everything again, just to be safe, to make sure that if you missed any of it, you get it again. And because you aren't able to ask me questions face to face, it'll be a little easier to do it this way. Just a reminder to how things are going to work. I'm going to do a video lesson. At any point, if you need to pause it, come back to it later, anything like that, please do it. Take the time to go look something up if you're not sure what I'm saying, whatever it might be. Take the opportunity to have a look at it again if you need to. You should have your notes out in front of you. I've given you those notes. You should have them home with you. If you don't, go onto the Google Classroom, and if you can print a set out, great. If you can have sort of two windows open, one with me and one with the notes on it, you can do that too. It'll be under Unit C, Resources, Notes, and Worksheets is where you'll find the notes for Unit C. So we're going to be doing Concept C4 again is what we're doing. I'll run through the lesson. At some points I may say, hey, this is a good time to pause and do the questions out of the textbook, or hey, this is a good time to pause and watch this video that I put up on the Google Classroom, something along those lines. So go ahead and do that as necessary if you need to. Pause, and then remember, if you have any questions for me, at any point, pop by during office hours, fire me an email, something along those lines, and we'll work our way through it. If you hear stomping, crying, or other unusual noises, it's probably my daughter Maddie who's upstairs terrorizing my wife. So if you have any questions, fire me an email. If not, we're going to get rolling. So I'm going to make the video window a little smaller, move it around for just a second while I hit present. I'm going to just switch back over real quick to get that in the top right corner. There we go. Okay, so we started talking about this already, dealing with Section 3, which is potentially harmful substances and how they get spread. This is Concept C4. And we are working through it again. This may seem like a bit of a review for you, but nonetheless, we're going to go through it again. So this comes straight out of the concepts for C4. Concept checklist is on the Google Classroom, and these are the things that you'll need to be able to do as we move our way through. So we're going to talk about how materials get transferred through air, water, and soil, and we'll identify the factors that may accelerate or slow down that transfer. We're going to describe the mechanisms for biodegradation and interpret information on biodegradability of different materials, those kinds of things. So we're going to go through a bunch of different stuff, and we'll play around with this a little bit as we move through. So transport of materials through air, soil, and water. We talked about this in class already. We know that pollutants come in all different shapes and sizes. They are things that we can struggle with from time to time to deal with. Sometimes, remember, the big message I've given you throughout the unit is that these pollutants are not necessarily bad in small amounts, but once they get into much larger amounts, they can become quite bad from time to time. So the source of pollutant may be in one place, but it can show up in many other places around the world. What we call, if you had a factory, that factory might be releasing a pollutant. That pollutant might get up into the air and get spread through the air, or that might release a pollutant into the water and get spread through the water. It isn't something that's always just localized right around that particular area. There's three stages of transport of substances in the environment. First off, there's the initial release of chemicals at the source in the environment. Then once those chemicals are released, they disperse, possibly into the atmosphere, or they get dispersed in water or even in soil, and then they get deposited after everything is done. So they float up into the air, for example, and then when they may become part of rain, or maybe there's not enough wind around to keep them aloft. They fall back down to the ground and get deposited. Same thing can happen with water as well. Deposition is the sort of the last stage that we talk about. We're going to go through these in the concept, so do pay attention as we go through, and pay close attention to how chemicals spread in similar and different ways depending on what they're moving through. Remember, we're going to talk about soil and water and air. I want you guys to be able to tell me the different ways that those, what's similar about how those pollutants move through the environment, but also what's different about how pollutants move through the environment depending on whether we're dealing with air, soil, or water. Transport in air. The direction and distance that airborne chemicals travel is determined by various factors, including the properties of the chemical pollutant. Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it broken down by sunlight or water? Right? All of those properties change the ability of that substance to be transported through air. Wind speed is a big one. If it's calm, often a pollutant will just go up into the air and then come right back down. If there's a lot of wind, then we're going to get a whole lot of dispersion taking place. The direction of prevailing winds is a big factor, and I know we talked a lot about this in class, that in Alberta, our direction of prevailing winds is generally from west to east, and so that means that we need to worry about the stuff that we're putting into the air getting over to Saskatchewan, or further on than that. We worry about the stuff that BC is putting into the air. So that's the direction of the prevailing winds. So those three factors will give us how far and in what direction those chemicals that get up into the air might travel. The distribution of particles may also be limited by lack of wind or precipitation. So obviously, if there's no wind around, those particles may not get spread as easily. If there's very little rain around, they could stay up into the air. Often, a lot of those particles get trapped by water in the air, in the atmosphere, and those particles end up getting brought back down to the ground, and we get deposition at that point. The further a chemical travels, the more difficult it is to identify its source, and borders don't matter to chemicals. So we have international agreements in place to help to prevent the spread of pollutants around the world. We know that they don't respect borders. You're not going to run up against the U.S. border and then all of a sudden that pollutant is going to drop out of the sky. Okay, so that's what happens with transport in air. This diagram, you can have a look at environmental transport on page 238 if you'd like to, if you've got some time to look at it. These are just showing ocean currents and surface wind currents in general that we get. Just so you get this is the equator along here in this diagram, and so obviously this is the North Pole and the South Pole, and we tend to get a general westerly wind blowing in our latitude up here in North America, but sometimes up around the polar areas they get easterly winds blowing from the east to the west. In the ocean currents you can see lots of different rotations, and I know we talked about this in class when we did this the first time, that in this area over the Atlantic is where we get our generation of a lot of hurricanes, because we've got lots of different currents that are moving through sort of at different angles that are causing the spinning of the air above the ocean to cause some of those hurricanes and things. So all of these are going to influence how stuff is transported through the air, those pollutants that we've been talking about all the way through. Transporting groundwater is a little bit different. Now, groundwater, remember, we said is the water that is below the surface of the earth. So it's the top of the groundwater zone in the soil is called the water table. So wherever the maximum height of the water is the top part of our groundwater zone. And then the bottom part of the groundwater zone is where we no longer find water. So this is the stuff that we find underground water, not water that's sitting on the surface. We said in class that the groundwater moves sideways or up or down and can move very slowly or very quickly. Relatively speaking, it's not moving as quickly as air Wind might move. It's definitely not moving as quickly as a river or a stream might move, but it does move. That groundwater does move. So if you have pollutant over here, it could end up moving slowly over here. And so if you've got a well that you've drilled over here and some pollutant got dumped into it, somebody over here could end up with that pollutant as well. Certain contaminants can remain collected in the groundwater for long periods of times, particularly if they're heavy metals. And this poses problems if the groundwater is used for drinking or agricultural purposes or industrial use. If that water isn't moving or doesn't move very much at all, and a groundwater source gets polluted, any wells or any water that's taken out of that groundwater source could be polluted for a very long time, and the well could become pretty much useless at that point. Factors that affect the movement in groundwater. The big one that we talked about in class and that I want to point out to you is this idea of pores. So the pores are the tiny spaces between soil grains. And you can kind of think of it as the difference between, paper has pores in it, but you can hold water in paper relatively easily for a short amount of time until those pores start to open up a bit, versus a sponge. A sponge has lots and lots and lots of little pores in it. And so the more pores you have, the easier a pollutant is going to be able to move through the soil and into the groundwater. So we talked about this before, and we brought up landfills a lot. The landfills that we create are created on this massive layer of clay, and that clay is tightly packed enough that the pores are almost non-existent. So we would say that when the pores are packed together very tightly and not connected, the soil is considered impermeable. So the soil underneath a landfill has the pores packed so tightly together that you're not going to get any movement of pollutant through that area. That's why it's safe to pile garbage and other things on top of a landfill. If the pores are connected, the soil is permeable and water can move through relatively easily. So the water or the soils that we have, let's say in our gardens or sandy soils, those ones have a lot of pores. So water tends to not collect on the top, but rather drain through. Okay. Pollutants which occur naturally or through human activities can move more quickly through permeable soil. So if you have a spill in very permeable soil of a pollutant, you need to get that pollutant out of the soil as quickly as possible, or isolate it somehow so that that pollutant doesn't get dragged down into the groundwater beneath it. And we're going to talk a little bit later on in this concept about ways that we can deal with pollutants that actually do get into the environment, and how we can handle that. And I'll have a couple of videos available for that as well. Transporting groundwater. This is just that summary table that I asked you guys to look at, and I suggested that you sort of pick a couple of these substances, and then understand where the source of those substances might be, and then some examples of it, and then whether those things occur naturally or by human activities. So I'd ask you to learn sort of a couple of rows on here. So a leaked substance might come from an underground storage tank or pipeline, and some examples of things that might leak could be gasoline or natural gas or oil. And then that's usually obviously caused by human activities. So try to learn a couple of these and have them ready for some of the formative and summative assessments that we might have coming up. Oops, cancel, didn't mean to do that. So the next thing we're moving on to is transport in surface water. So just to remember the distinction, groundwater means it's below the ground, usually quite a bit below the ground, below the soil. Surface water is the stuff that's on the surface of the earth. So things like rivers or lakes, ponds, sloughs, bogs, fens, all sorts of different kinds of things or bodies of water that sit on the surface. Hazardous chemicals can enter surface water from the air. It can come up from the groundwater. It can come along the surface of the earth from agricultural fields or industrial sites or outflows through runoff, and can get into lots of different areas as a result of that. A substance that dissolves in water may be easily carried by water a fair distance and dispersed over a wide area. And I know in class we talked briefly about the challenges of dealing with things that are water-based, because what ends up happening is, especially water that flows, that stuff moves all the way through. I don't know if you guys can hear my dog going nuts upstairs. Sorry about that. If water moves or flows like it does in a river or stream or even in the ocean, what ends up happening is whatever pollutant can get spread all over an area and makes it very hard to contain. And we talked about Exxon Valdez, which was a tanker spill off the coast of Alaska. Oh boy, back in the 80s, I believe it was. We talked about the Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico. There was a movie made about it. And we talked about the importance of what they did to try to stop that and how challenging it was. So it can be, particularly certain things can get carried very easily through surface water, and it can be challenged to clean it up. Substances that do not dissolve easily may sink to the bottom and become concentrated close to the source, which is maybe good for us because then we know where it is. It sinks to the bottom, we can get it out of the bottom and deal with it. But that's going to cause lots of problems with organisms in the immediate area. However, if a substance doesn't dissolve easily or isn't heavy enough to sink down to the bottom, it could disperse over a long range, and the sooner we get out there to deal with that problem, the better. Because humans use drinking water or water for drinking, I can't read the bottom, and agricultural use, its quality is monitored regularly. And we talked about this again. We have somebody that comes to Riley School every single week to test the water at Riley School to see how clean and safe that water is. And so we do that regularly. You should be, if you have a well, you should be testing your water relatively regularly to make sure that nothing has gone in and contaminated that water, because it can be very challenging if something does. Now, transport in soil is sort of that bridge between surface and groundwater, right? We've got stuff sitting on the top and stuff sitting below, and then the soil is in between. We talked about the big one that limits movement of water through soil to get into groundwater is those pores, and whether they're very porous, meaning quite permeable, or not porous at all, meaning impermeable. In soil, water can be moved in one of four ways. We can end up getting evaporation, absorption by plants, runoff, and then soaking into the soil, dissolving substances. So evaporation would mean if there's something that's near the surface, it could evaporate up into the atmosphere, out of the soil into the atmosphere, and become an airborne pollutant at that point. If the pollutant stays in the soil for long enough, it could be absorbed by plants, causing problems for those plants in the area, and then maybe ultimately something else that goes and eats those plants. Soil could the pollutant could run along the surface of the soil as well as runoff, and get transported along the surface and into a body of water, and becoming part of surface water. But as that water or as that pollutant moves along, what could end up happening is we could end up with some of it being dissolved and soaking into the soil. Something that is dissolved and moves into the soil is called a leachate, and that's that term right there. So leachate is when something gets dissolved either from the surface and gets brought down, or maybe it's brought by one runoff and percolates down into the soil. That thing that's moving down carrying the pollutant is called leachate. The types of soil plays an important role in how quickly water passes through it. we've already said this. Packed clay is impermeable. That's why we use it on the underside of sanitary landfills, because it prevents leaching. Organic material, right, can absorb fluids and slow their movement through the soil. And I think I gave you guys the example of a time, maybe it wasn't in this section, where I was involved in creating a wetland between a fish hatchery in Calgary and the Elbow River that the fish hatchery pulled water out of for its purposes, but released water back into as well. And they created a series of wetlands in between the fish hatchery and the river so that the wetlands could do some of that filtration before it got back to the river, to the point where they were getting water that was as clean or cleaner getting back into the river after they'd used it in the fish hatchery, which I thought was pretty cool. And they used lots of different structures along the way to make that happen, which included soil structures full of organic material that can absorb pollutants and slow their movement down. They had ponds that would slow down enough that would allow things to fall down to the bottom and be used at the bottom of the pond by bacteria and other creatures. And they had areas that are full of lots of reeds and other grasses that where the some of the pollutants could maybe be absorbed out of the water as well. It was a really cool project. Used to be called the Sam Livingston Fish Hatchery, if you want to look it up at some point. Hazardous chemicals can be changed by other chemicals that are also present in the soil. So for example, if we have an acid that starts to move its way into a soil that is basic, we know that acids and bases react to neutralize. So we actually have soils in Alberta that tend to be naturally basic. So that means that certain amounts of acid that enter into our soils will be neutralized by the bases that are already in the soils and can mitigate or make less harmful some of the problems that we might get from an acid spill. Huge amounts of acids like might be spilled from a rail car or something like that, that's not going to be neutralized completely by the soil. We'll have bigger problems associated with that. The other thing that we want to mention here is that the daily use of hydrocarbons in vehicles and industry can also contaminate the soil. Whether it's stuff that we throw up into the air and gets brought down, maybe as acid rain or in other forms of pollution that get caught in the rain, but also when we get, let's say somebody spills gasoline or oil in an area at a gas station, something like that, it contaminates the soil surrounding. I remember in Edmonton on White Avenue, there used to be a gas station up until about maybe 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, on a particular corner, and they wanted to redevelop that corner. And it took them years and a lot of work to basically take the soil out from around that particular gas station because it was so full of oil and hydrocarbon pollution from the gas station being there, whether it was a leaky tank, whether it was people spilling gasoline or oil, whatever it might be. So it took them years to remediate that site, to clean it up so that we could build a big building on top of it and it wasn't going to cause problems later on. So some of these hydrocarbon emissions are carried by the air into the soil or are carried by water where they can clog up soil pores. Usually that happens close to the source of the contamination. And hydrocarbons are toxic to plants and animals. If you get and I'm going to have a video that you guys can watch shortly on oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It's really, really dangerous when it gets near plants and animals, particularly heavy oils that we might be taking out of the ground, those kinds of things. So at this point, I think it's a good opportunity for you to pause, take a breather, and have a look at page 242 of your textbook. I've also posted up a couple of videos that I think might be worthwhile checking out at this point too, if you want a break from listening to me talk at you. There's under the resources and then video and other resources in the Google Classroom under Unit C. You'll be able to find a video on air pollution, a video on plastic pollution in the oceans, as well as something on the Gulf oil spill and how it's affected birds. So now might be a good time for you to pause and have a look at that section. So now that you're back, we're going to move into the last section of C4, which is basically where we're going to try to say, okay, well, we got these pollutants in the air, or we got the pollutants in the soil, or whatever it might be. What do we do? How do we deal with them? And so this is where we're going to get into talking about some of the things that we can do. Things like bioremediation, phytoremediation, those kinds of things. But before we do that, I want to jump back to talking about dispersion and dilution again. So this section is changing the concentration of harmful chemicals in the environment. The concentration of chemicals in the environment can be changed using different techniques. First is by scattering the substance away from its source, what we would call dispersion. And the second would be dilution, which reduces the concentration of the pollutant by mixing it with large quantities of air or water. For example, a fast-flowing river or air mass can disperse a chemical very, very quickly. Now, this happens naturally, but it could be used as a way to change the concentration. The problem is if we're not keeping track of how much pollutant we might be putting into the environment, it may disperse or be diluted downstream or downwind of wherever we are, but it can still cause problems depending on the amount of pollutant that's being put into the atmosphere or into the water. So again, we set regulations. Governments set regulations that require acceptable levels of pollutants to be achieved. And if they're not achieved, then those polluters will end up getting charged for whatever reason. If polluters are having issues, what they've been able to do is develop technologies that allow them to deal with the problem even before the pollution leaves where it's being created. So I think we've talked about scrubbers before. Scrubbers were or are technologies put in smokestacks or other places that basically pull a pollution out of the smokestack before it gets up into the atmosphere. I believe we talked about gypsum as being often collected by scrubbers, and then we use it for various purposes like fertilizers or drywall or something along those lines. The other one that just popped to mind and then popped right out of my mind, oh shoot, it'll come back to me in a minute. So what I want to do is talk about some of the other alternatives that are out there to take this stuff out of the atmosphere or out of the water and deal with it in a relatively easy way. So this diagram is just basically talking about the different kinds of chemicals that can get out there, and so up here are the different things that are contributing to the water problems that we might have, and then where dispersion and dilution might be taking place and what might end up happening along the way here. So disease-causing bacteria and viruses can disperse, and then that can cause issues associated with that. We can have salts or nutrients that are being dispersed into the environment from these sources here. Pesticides, heavy metals, some of them can find their way all the way down to the bottom of the water and end up laying at the bottom of the water and causing problems along the way there. So just a quick summary there. But what I wanted to do is start to talk about some of the technologies that have been developed. Remember, a technology is something that humans employ to make a job easier for us, and so we use these technologies to deal with pollution in different ways. So the first one that I think is really cool is biodegradation. And so let's break the word down, because I like to do that. We all know that the prefix bio means living. So automatically we're talking about living things in some way. Degradation That comes from the word degrade. Degrade means to break down or to make smaller in some way. So we're using living things to break stuff down. And this occurs in the environment because living things like earthworms or bacteria or fungi are actively breaking down substances, including many pollutants. But they have to usually be organic substances, meaning that they were made initially in a living thing of some sort. So this happens naturally. I mean, biodegradation is composting, right? You get the stuff that you create in your kitchen, the waste of whatever plant or animal matter you're cooking with in the kitchen. You go put it out in the compost heap, and bacteria and earthworms and fungi begin to break that down and turn it into compost. That's biodegradation. We use these microorganisms, micro meaning really, really tiny, to do this biodegradation, and they're especially important and are becoming more important as time goes by in the breaking down of pollutants. So what happens is the existing organic molecules inside our pollutants provide carbon atoms, which are used to build biological compounds such as carbohydrates and proteins. So if you think back to concept C2, we talked about carbohydrates and proteins, and each of those have carbon molecules in them, or atoms in them, that we need. And so these little tiny bacteria or fungi or even earthworms are taking these pollutants and they're breaking them down and turning them into something useful for themselves. Usually it's a multi-step process in which a large organic molecule gets broken down inside the bacteria into smaller and smaller pieces, and then it gets reused. It's a great thing for us because we can use these bacteria to fight pollution, and the bacteria do the work for us rather than us having to do the work. So some bacteria can grow and reproduce only when oxygen is present. And so these bacteria use what's called aerobic biodegradation. So they have to have oxygen around to make that happen. And so depending on the type of pollutant we're trying to break down, we might use an aerobic bacterium because we know there's going to be lots of access to oxygen. So we might do that on the surface of the water. We might do that top of the soil or maybe in air. But when oxygen is not present, maybe at the bottom of a lake or deep down in the soil, then we can end up using anaerobic bacteria. Anaerobic, an in this case means without. So we're dealing without oxygen. So deep in those landfills or deep down under the soil. And some bacteria then can be used to break down pollutants deep down in the soil. So they can remove chlorine from harmful chlorine-containing compounds, things called PCBs, also known as polychlorinated biphenyls. Just know PCBs. You don't need to know polychlorinated biphenyls. And some of these PCBs come in the oils that we use in our vehicles or in some of the electrical equipment that we have. And if it gets into the environment, these PCBs can be harmful. They can stay in the soil for a while. They can be taken up by plants. Then we can consume them or other animals can consume them, and it causes problems. So what we can do is use these bacteria then to basically go in and eat up these PCBs, break them down, and make them not harmful anymore. And the bacteria basically just use them as food. It's kind of cool. Some things that affect biodegradation. So obviously during the winter, biodegradation is very slow because we know that things like to live in warmer temperatures, and bacteria don't do a very good job of breaking things down in the middle of winter. So that slows down the rate of biodegradation. So if a spill happens in the wintertime, one of the challenges might be is cleaning it up right away with biodegradation because the bacteria are just going to freeze solid. So it may slow things down. Some other things that might affect it might be soil moisture, pH, oxygen supply, and nutrient availability. The bacteria need the same kinds of things that our cells do. If the soil is too acidic or basic, if there's not enough oxygen around, if there's not enough nutrients around, the bacteria aren't going to be able to do what they need to do. So that slows down the process. There's also things called bioreactors, which are a new technology that speeds up the rate of biodegradation by adding water to organic waste in a sanitary landfill. And these bioreactors, actually, we use special bacteria that can even produce things like methane. Methane is natural gas, which then we can use to do other things. And if I remember when I'm done, I'll throw a link to the bioreactor that is being used in the landfill just outside Edmonton, because it's something neat to look at. Planting vegetation also encourages faster biodegradation because the populations of bacteria and fungi are larger around the plants and roots. And this higher level of biodiversity, think way back to section or Unit A, that helps to promote more microbial or bacterial activity. You know, a ecosystem is healthier when there's lots of organisms around in it. So planting stuff in an area may help with that biodegradation process. I wanted to talk about a specific form of biodegradation called phytoremediation, and this is a technique that can be used to reduce the concentration of harmful chemicals in soil or groundwater. And the prefix phyto in here means plants. So when you see phyto, that means plants. And then remediation, I like to think of it as cleaning up. So we're using plants to clean up. So plants have been used to clean up metals, hydrocarbons, solvents, pesticides, radioactive materials, explosives, and even landfill leachates. Remember, leachates are the chemicals that get brought down as water percolates through a landfill. And plants are able to absorb and accumulate large amounts of these chemicals. When the plants are matured, they can be harvested, burned, or even composted. And in some cases, we can actually treat them in such a way as to get the metal back, and we could even reuse the metal, which is kind of cool. When most of the harmful chemicals are removed by phytoremediation, then other plants can be planted there. So the whole purpose is we go in, we've got an area that's contaminated, we're going to try to phytoremediate the area. So we plant a bunch of plants on the area, and we let the plants do their thing. They suck up those chemicals, and if the chemicals are really dangerous, then we pull all the plants out of there and we burn them. And we get rid of the plants and we get rid of the chemicals. And we pulled the chemicals out of the soil or out of the groundwater. If the chemicals aren't super harmful, maybe we can find a way to recycle those chemicals in such a way or break them down in a different way. So kind of a neat technology to think about. The last one is interesting, photolysis. Photo means light. Lysis means to break apart. So photolysis is using light, sunlight, to break down compounds. Okay, and the formation of ozone is an example of this process. And this is how ozone works: is we get nitrogen dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. It gets broken down into nitrogen monoxide and oxygen. That oxygen atom finds another oxygen molecule, finds another oxygen atom, and it creates ozone. But it can't happen without light doing some of that breaking down. So light will actually take some chemicals that get up into the atmosphere or sit on the surface of the earth and actually break them down as well. Another example of photolysis might be photodegradable plastic. Photo meaning light. So we're using light to degrade plastic. And photodegradable plastic is made of chemicals that react when exposed to sunlight. And in 3 months, the plastic becomes a fine powder and it's easier to dispose of. So you can imagine if we're using lots of plastic bags and we wanted to use photodegradable plastic bags, we could basically use them, throw them in a landfill, and they would break down on their own. We all know that plastic is a big problem for us, and the video that you may have already watched on plastic pollution sort of highlights that as well. The problem with that is if it gets buried, then it's going to last and last and last and stay exactly the way it is for hundreds of years. So it doesn't really work unless we can expose it to sunlight. So that is the end of concept C4. I've been talking at you for a long time. I'm going to skip over to a different slide here and show you guys what I need you to do for the remaining for the remaining sort of rest of Concept C4 here. So these are the resources I want you to use. That was me teaching you the lesson. Now it's up to you to take the time to learn some of this stuff. And if you can't, if you're struggling with it for whatever reason, then please track me down and I will give you a hand with all of this. So resources that you can use, things that will help you out. Your textbook, pages 237 through 247, are running through what you need to know for Concept C4. I mentioned these videos already. There's one more I'm tacking on to this here. So there's one on air pollution I put in the Google Classroom. There's one on plastic pollution, something on the Gulf oil spill, and then this one on bioremediation. Give this one a bit of a chance. It's really good. They did a really good job, but the accents, you have to listen a little bit carefully to that. Then what I would like you to do is work your way through the practice questions, okay, out of your textbook. And then I'd like you to go ahead and have a look at worksheet number 3, Concept C4. That is in the Google Classroom under Unit C, Resources, and then Notes and Worksheets. Okay, and I'll post a key to that here shortly under the Keys section under Resources. And then I'm going to post at some point, maybe even by the time you get this done, some formative questions through a Google form in Google Classroom. And you can answer them, turn them in, and then what I will do is I will go through and check your answers to see how they look. And if they're good, then at that point you can do the quiz that I will post up later this week. So your goal for this week, Science 9s, is to get through Concept C4 by the end of this week. So this is your start. I will, encourage you to get to this stuff and work through it as you can, and then I will have that quiz posted up hopefully Wednesday or Thursday this week. So I hope that's worked well for you. Again, if you have any questions, pop by for office hours, and I'll be posting those shortly, or fire me an email, and we will work our way through. I hope that this has worked for me. I guess the last thing I'll mention, or worked for you, the last thing I mentioned is I'm new at this. So if you guys want to give me some feedback at some point, let me know how it worked for you. Is there something I could do differently? Is there something you want more of or less of? Hey, I'm learning all through this with you guys as well. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed, somewhat enjoyed, seeing my face, sitting in my basement, hanging out. And if you have any questions, track me down. Stay healthy and keep away from each other for now. Let's try to get through this pandemic. Talk to you guys soon.